Hi there, my name is Dr. Dorothy Buchli, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this video. So this is going to wrap up our discussion of working memory. So the particular model of working memory that we've been discussing is Badley and Hitch's 1974 multi-component model. Right? So this model was comprised of three components, right? So we had the visual spatial sketchpad for visual and spatial information, the phonological loop for verbal and auditory information, and the central executive as the traffic cop, if you will, that coordinated information between those two systems in accordance with whatever task demands you were experiencing, right? So in 2000, the year 2000, Alan Badley decided to update the model, and there were two principal updates. So the first is he included an additional component known as the episodic buffer, and he also, in the model, incorporated working memory, or rather, the interplay between the components of working memory and long-term memory. So let's go ahead and take a look. Here's a really nice visual depiction of the model. So it looks very similar to the 1974 model. So we have, again, the phonological loop for verbal and auditory information, the visuospatial sketchpad for visual and spatial information, and then the central executive, which kind of coordinates information between those two systems. But we also have the addition of a conduit, if you will, between the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visual spatial sketchpad, and long-term memory. And this is actually really, really important. So let's consider a task that is thought to require working memory. So let's imagine that you are reading a book. Okay, so you're reading a really, really engrossing book that you're really interested in. Maybe it's a romance, maybe it's a mystery, maybe it's some kind of a scientific book. Okay, and as you're reading the sentence, okay, your phonological loop is holding those words in mind as you read them. Okay. Your visual spatial sketchpad, if there's any kind of diagrams or pictures, okay, those are being registered there. But critically, there's an interplay or constant interaction between those working memory elements and your long-term memory. So for example, your phonological loop is holding those words in mind, but more critically, you're using your long-term memory, your semantic long-term memory, to understand the definitions of the words, what the words mean. You're also using your semantic long-term memory to understand how the plot is evolving, right? To remember each of the characters' names and their backstory, right? As well as the grammar and syntax and meaning of the sentence, maybe some literary devices. So maybe you notice some metaphors playing out or some foreshadowing or other literary devices. All of that is going to necessitate not only your phonological loop holding current information in mind, but also an interplay between what's currently in your working memory and what already resides in your long-term memory. So the point of the revision of the original working memory model was to incorporate that very important working between long-term memory and working memory, or that relationship, if you will, between long-term memory and working memory. What about the episodic buffer, right? Well, we've already seen with Badley and Hitch's three-component model that we can explain results like the phonological similarity effect, the word length effect. We can see, mental rotation, mental arithmetic. All of those things are really nicely accounted for in the original three-component model. But there are a couple of findings that are incongruent or that don't make sense. Right? So for example, going back to the example of reading your favorite book, okay? It's possible for us as humans to be able to process very lengthy sentences, some of which are more than 15 to 20 words, despite the fact that 15 or 20 words far exceeds the capacity of the phonological loop. And we're able to retain these words while working very effectively with our long-term memories. So in essence, the episodic buffer is a subsystem of working memory that handles the brief storage of episodic memories when the phonological loop or the sketchpad are otherwise engaged. We also see that, so we've seen with the word length effect, right, that longer words are less well recalled than shorter words, right, because longer words profit from fewer rehearsals. We've also seen that if we block rehearsal, thereby preventing the phonological loop from rehearsing information, it's much, much harder to recall that information. But recollection isn't at zero, right? So people are still, even under when they're saying the over and over again, they're still able to recall something, right? So even when we can't utilize rehearsal, we're still able to remember some of what we're trying to remember. So again, the episodic buffer is a subsystem of working memory that's thought to handle the brief storage of memories when we can't use the phonological loop effectively, or when the visual spatial sketchpad or the phonological loop are filled up or filled to capacity. Okay. Another really, really important function of the episodic buffer is the episodic buffer is going to integrate phonological, visual, and spatial information together, right? Because for a lot of our memories, okay, we don't just have visual components or spatial components or auditory components, but especially when we're talking about episodic memories for events and experiences in our lives, those episodic memories, because they're events and experiences, are going to be really, really complex and multifaceted. And they're going to include not just visual and spatial information, but also phonological information as well. So the episodic buffer is thought to be the component of working memory that's responsible for integrating all of that information into a single representation that starts out in our working memory and eventually becomes a long-term memory. And lastly, like I was saying, the episodic buffer kind of helps to facilitate that link between working memory and long-term memory. So just to recap, Badley's 2000 model of working memory is an updated version of the original 1974 model. Okay. And both models describe a system for temporary storage of information, but they also include other components, right? So We have the central executive, which is a domain general system responsible for coordinating information between the two subsystems. We obviously have the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. And then we have the addition of the episodic buffer and also just a depiction of how memory is integrated between the different systems, and also how working memory is linked with long-term memory. Okay, so I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.